News of the struggle spread far beyond the city. Across the country, people were paying attention. Some sent money to help, others wrote letters of support. Leaders, activists, even everyday citizens began to see that this was not just one city's fight. It was a battle for justice that belonged to everyone. And then after months of walking, of organizing, of facing threats and hardship, the day finally came. A decision was made, a ruling that would change everything. The highest court in the land declared that segregation on public buses was unconstitutional. The law that had forced people to the back, that had divided them for so long, was struck down. The news spread like wildfire. People rejoiced, hugging one another, some crying tears they had held back for too long. It was a victory, not just for those who had refused to ride, but for all who had dared to believe that change was possible. But even in that moment of triumph, they knew the fight was not over. This was only one battle in a much larger war against injustice. There would be more struggles, more sacrifices, more moments of doubt. But now they knew something undeniable. When people stood together, when they refused to accept injustice as normal, they could shake the foundations of a system that had seemed unbreakable. As the buses filled once more, people took their seats, not in the back, not in the front, but wherever they chose. It was a simple act, yet it carried the weight of generations who had fought for that very right. And so, the ride that began as an act of defiance became something greater, a symbol, a movement, a reminder that even the smallest acts of courage could inspire waves of change. The road ahead was still long, but they had proven one thing beyond doubt. Change was not just possible. It was inevitable. It was a day like any other, or so it seemed. The hum of a bus engine filled the air as passengers shuffled aboard, each carrying their own stories, their own hopes, their own burdens. But this wasn't just any bus ride. This was a ride that would change everything, not just for the people sitting in those seats, but for an entire nation grappling with the weight of injustice. Picture this. A quiet, unassuming figure sitting near the middle of the bus, clutching their belongings. They weren't looking for trouble, only a moment of peace after a long day. But the world around them had other plans. The air was thick with an unspoken tension, a constant reminder of the invisible lines drawn by society, dividing people based on the color of their skin. As the bus filled with passengers, an all too familiar demand echoed through the aisle. Get up. Move to the back. It wasn't a request. It was a rule, one enforced with cold precision for years. Most people complied without question, either too tired or too scared to resist. But not this time. This time, something was different. The person remained seated, their hands trembling slightly, but their resolve unshaken. The driver's voice grew louder, angrier, but the figure refused to budge. Other passengers turned their heads, some in shock, others in quiet approval, though fear kept their support silent. In that moment, the act of staying seated was more than defiance. It was a declaration. A line had been crossed too many times, and enough was enough. This wasn't just about a seat on a bus. It was about dignity. It was about fairness. It was about standing or sitting for what was right, even when the world seemed determined to push you down. The ripple effects of that small, courageous act would extend far beyond that bus. It would ignite conversations, spark protests, and eventually force a nation to confront its ugliest truths. But what gave this one ride such power? Why did this single moment, on an ordinary bus in an ordinary town, inspire a movement that would shake the foundations of systemic racism? What was it about this one act of resistance that resonated so deeply, so universally? As we journey through this story, you'll meet the individuals who risked everything to fight for justice. You'll hear about the sleepless nights spent organizing, the marches that filled the streets, and the unyielding determination of those who refuse to be silenced. You'll see how one person's quiet courage became a rallying cry for millions, proving that even the smallest actions can create waves of change. But this isn't just a story of struggle. It's a story of hope, resilience, and the power of unity. It's about the way ordinary people, when united by a common purpose, can accomplish the extraordinary. It's about a ride that started as an injustice and ended as a symbol of progress. So what happened next on that fateful day? Did the person stay seated, or were they forcibly removed? Did the passengers rally together, or did fear keep them silent? And how did this one act ripple across the world, inspiring movements that continue to this day? Stay with us as we uncover the answers and relive the ride that became a turning point in the fight against racism. Because this story isn't just history, it's a reminder of what's possible when we choose to stand up, or sit down, for what's right. The silence on the bus was deafening. The driver's glare burned into the passenger who refused to move. The air grew thick with unspoken words, unexpressed emotions, anger, fear, defiance. Other passengers shifted uncomfortably in their seats, eyes darting between the driver and the unmoving figure. Some clutched their belongings tighter, others looked away, unwilling to witness what they knew was coming. A few seats away, an elderly woman let out a quiet sigh. She had seen this before. She had spent years watching people like her be pushed aside, treated as less than, told to know their place. She wanted to speak up, to offer some words of support, but fear held her tongue. After all, what could she do? The world had been this way for as long as she could remember. And yet something about this moment felt different. The driver, growing impatient, finally stepped down from his seat and marched toward the defiant passenger. His voice was sharp, edged with authority. I said, "Move to the back." Still, no movement. The bus had come to a halt now, blocking traffic. People outside began to take notice. A few pedestrians paused, peering through the windows. The tension was no longer confined to the bus. It was spilling into the streets. Minutes passed, though they felt like hours. And then the inevitable happened. The driver stormed off the bus, disappearing for a moment before returning with two uniformed officers. Their expressions were unreadable, but their presence alone was enough to make the passengers shrink into their seats. The officers approached, their heavy boots thudding against the floor. One of them spoke, his voice low but firm. "You need to come with us." The passenger inhaled deeply, steadying themselves. They had expected this. They had played this moment over and over in their mind before ever stepping onto that bus. They knew the risks, knew what might happen. And yet they had made their decision long before this moment arrived. The officers reached down, gripping their arm, and in that instant, something shifted. A murmur rippled through the bus. A young woman near the front turned in her seat, her knuckles white from gripping the edge. A man in a worn-out work uniform clenched his jaw. The elderly woman's hands trembled. For years, people had looked away, afraid of what speaking up might cost them. But now, as they watched the officers drag the passenger from their seat, the weight of their silence felt unbearable. Outside, a small crowd had formed. Some whispered among themselves, others simply stared. A young boy tugged at his mother's sleeve, asking what was happening. His mother didn't have an answer. The passenger was led off the bus, the hush of the crowd broken only by the faint sound of a camera shutter. A journalist, having happened upon the scene, had captured the moment. A moment that would soon be seen by thousands. The next morning, the city buzzed with the news. It was on the radio, in the papers, spreading from neighbor to neighbor. Whispers turned into conversations. Conversations turned into plans. Plans turned into action. For some, it was just another arrest, another person facing consequences for stepping out of line. But for others, it was a spark, a call to do something more. A group of leaders gathered in a small meeting hall, their voices steady but urgent. "We can't let this go unnoticed," one of them said. "This is our chance to make a stand." They spoke of a boycott, a refusal to ride the buses until change was made. It was risky. Many of them relied on public transportation for work, for survival. But they knew this was bigger than inconvenience. This was about dignity. The word spread like wildfire. Flyers were passed out in churches, at barbershops, on street corners. People talked in hushed voices, weighing the risks, the sacrifices. The city officials dismissed the movement at first. "It won't last," they said. "They'll come back when they get tired of walking." But the people did not tire. Day after day, week after week, they walked miles in the sweltering heat, in the pouring rain, in the bitter cold. Drivers looked out onto half-empty buses. Business owners noticed fewer customers. The impact was undeniable. The movement was growing stronger, not weaker. And then the threats began. Letters, phone calls, warnings from those who wanted things to remain the way they were. Some leaders received messages telling them to stop, to back down. Others found themselves followed, their families placed in danger. The conflict was no longer just about a single seat on a bus. It was about power, about a system that had been built to keep people in their place. And those in power were willing to fight to keep it that way. The tension reached its breaking point when a home was bombed late one night. The explosion shattered windows, shook the walls, sent a family scrambling for safety. But even in the face of fear, the people refused to stop. They gathered in the streets, holding hands, singing songs of resistance. Their voices, once hushed in fear, now rang loud and clear. The city could feel it. Change was coming. The question was no longer if, but when. The smoke still lingered in the air, the shattered glass crunching beneath cautious footsteps. The bombing was meant to silence them, to break their spirit. But instead, it did the opposite. That very night, more people gathered than ever before. Some came in anger, some in fear, but all with the same determination. They would not be pushed back into silence. A man stepped forward, his voice steady but filled with emotion. "They want us to be afraid. They want us to give up. But we have walked too far to turn around now." A murmur of agreement swept through the crowd. Someone else spoke up. Then another, and another. The fear that had kept them silent for so long was cracking, giving way to something stronger, unity. Meanwhile, in offices behind closed doors, officials and business owners were beginning to feel the weight of the boycott. The city's bus system was losing money, and pressure was mounting. Some tried to dismiss it, claiming it would fade in time, but the empty seats told a different story. The movement was not fading, it was growing.